Thank you, Kelly. Thank you all for this opportunity to speak with you regarding the social impacts, or as we call the human dimensions, of chronic wasting disease. And I'd like to share with you that this talk is an upgrade of a talk that we gave in 2009 looking at the state of our knowledge of the human dimensions of chronic wasting disease. So with that, I'm going to be kind of as John Fisher did this morning, bring in two of my colleagues with whom I can collaborate on chronic wasting disease research, Jerry Vasky from Colorado State University and Mark Needham from Oregon State. So the human dimensions of chronic wasting disease, we began our studies with human dimensions of CWD, the first paper published in 2003, so it's relatively new compared to a lot of the biological and biochemistry work that many of you have been doing. So it's been about 14 years now, and in that time we've had 43 publications come out dealing with the human dimensions of chronic wasting disease. The goal of the human dimensions research is to measure the variables that affect policy, regulations, managerial problems, and scientific understanding. Our role is to inform the scientists and the managers of what the different public stakeholders' views are concerning CWD. The CWD studies have been conducted in a number of states. We've had 4 studies in Illinois, Wisconsin, and then a large study of 8 Western states funded by the Western Association of Fish and Wildlife Agencies, and then a small study done in Maryland just a few years ago, and 2 studies planned in Minnesota and Pennsylvania. We can look at the human dimensions research in chronic wasting disease in roughly, generally speaking, about 3 phases. The first phase was looking at the initial outbreaks and the reactions to these initial outbreaks. So that's roughly between 2003 and 2008. And these were studies focused primarily on hunters' reactions and behaviors and behavioral intentions regarding CWD. Were they going to be buying licenses? Were they going to be hunting in the same places? Were they even going to be considering hunting at all, or were they going to be moving out of state? And with those, we also looked at trust in agencies and agency management and the risks that people perceived regarding CWD. So the participations of CWD, do they affect hunters' willingness to hunt? And Wisconsin saw about a 10% decline in hunting license sales with the outbreak of CWD. Many of these license purchasers have returned, but what we don't know is, are they hunting in the same areas that they used to hunt, or have they shifted their focus to other parts of the state? We look at the role and the effect that these have on license sales and therefore management operation budgets. Is this impacting the ability to use hunters then to effectively manage wildlife and expanding deer populations in some of these regions of the states? And diverting funds from the management programs for chronic wasting disease. And are these shifts in hunter behavior impacting the social and economic stability of the relative rural communities which depend on hunting license dollars? And in some cases, this can be severe. The stakeholder pressure on the agencies to manage CWD. The themes that we've outlined in our research to date, the hunters, the changing hunting behavior, their concerns and perceptions of chronic wasting disease, not just in terms of human health, but also how is this affecting deer populations, and especially at the local level where they hunt. And we all know that hunters have very specific notions about how many deer are out there, so having CWD added to it only compounds that perception. Knowledge about CWD. What do they know about CWD? How factual are they in their perceptions of CWD? And the acceptance of various management strategies that are proposed or in plan, and the evaluation then of these management strategies, and then do they trust the agency to effectively manage CWD? We also look at beliefs of other stakeholders, non-hunting landowners, homeowners, citizens, and in the Western states, they've also examined the guides and outfitters and their perception of chronic wasting disease and the impact this has on their business. Overall, there have been 2 studies done on economic impacts of chronic wasting disease, not a lot, not a large body of work, but they are showing that in some cases on local level, there can be some at least temporary economic impacts due to the outbreak of chronic wasting disease. And how can agencies cope with managing CWD? Looking at the limited workforce and the limited human resources that the agencies have to begin with, is this being effective? And how are stakeholders perceiving the agency in terms of response to chronic wasting disease outbreaks? From 2009 to 2012, studies started to shift a little bit to look at having greater focus on the trust and agency management, and especially with hunters and using them as the primary stakeholders. Do they trust the way the agency is managing? Do they trust the information coming out of from the agency? Do they feel that the agency is using, in their perception, the best science possible to manage chronic wasting disease? Added to that, then, the perceived risk to human health and perceived risk to deer populations. What we're finding is we have hunters on a spectrum from those who are very risk sensitive to those who are rather risk averse. And these hunters fall across the spectrum across all aspects of their life. So where we're looking at bringing hunters in R3 and recruitment, and we're looking at hunters along, for example, the locavore movement, and wanting to get natural meat. These are showing up to be some of the hunters who are most sensitive to chronic wasting disease, and they're the ones who are most likely to drop out. So it's in some cases, CWD can pull the rug out from underneath our efforts in recruitment and retention. And we have also a lot of evidence building that their perception of risk of chronic wasting disease is also concurrent with the perception of risk of other foodborne and insect-borne diseases as well. Trust in the agency management is paramount to having stakeholder support for managing chronic wasting disease. I'll share a little bit more with this here in a few slides. Across most states, the majority of the hunters are concerned about the impact of chronic wasting disease. More than 60% have indicated nationwide in our studies that they are worried about CWD. They're worried about it in the areas where they hunt. They're worried and concerned that it will get into the areas where they hunt if it isn't found there already. More than 50% have expressed some level of concern about eating meat, eating venison, if they're in states with CWD present. We find we have a kind of a gradient. The first thing that will happen is they don't want to feed the venison to their children. Then they don't want to feed it to the wife and their children, but they'll still eat it. And finally, under hypothetical situations, if the concentration gets high enough, they won't eat the meat themselves, but they will still hunt. And they still indicate that I will still hunt, but I'm not going to eat the meat. And that raises the question then of what are they going to do with the animal? So giving up hunting is the last resort. Giving up eating venison, not so much. More than 45% believe that it can cause human disease, contrary to some of the messages that were out. What we're discussing here today and what's been out in the papers with some of the recent studies, we're going to be going back and looking at this because it may start to cause some real confusion on the part of hunters. They've been hearing a certain consistent message all along, and now all of a sudden it might not be quite so much. So there's a lot of confusion on some of the hunters' parts. Some hunters, they don't care. And those who did not hunt due to CWD, they're 16 times more likely to perceive human risk from chronic wasting disease. What do they know? Well, most hunters, the vast majority of hunters, over 70% in our recent studies, have heard of chronic wasting disease. Their sources are newspapers, some of the outdoor press, the state outdoor newspapers, word of mouth, some on TV and news, outdoor magazines, Sports Afield, Outdoor Life, agency publications, regulations, and various websites. But more than half have a very poor knowledge of chronic wasting disease. They know the species and some of the symptoms, but they're ill-informed as to the effects, how to deal with infected animals, turning it over to the positive cases over to the state agencies. But they're early on, some hunters were expressing that they would just cook it really well, as they would say with, they heard the messaging from rabies. Well, if you just cook it really well, it'll be okay. So there is a lot of misunderstanding and misperceptions about chronic wasting disease out there in the hunting public. They don't always know the areas, the degree of prevalence, the areas within their state, the degree of prevalence of the disease, or that there has been no evidence of it crossing the species barrier into humans. The agency information is helping them with this, but at the same time, it's not getting to all hunters at all times. Having agency reports out there is useful, but the hunters aren't reading those by and large. Fact sheets are one way that has been shown to be helpful, that the hunters are indicating that this is one source of information that they like to get. Something very short, very concise, and bullet pointed. Hunter opinions of management across most states. These studies shown that hunters want to have testing facilities for their harvested deer. And they also want to see testing and surveillance so that they know the prevalence of CWD in their state. Doing nothing is not acceptable to the majority of hunters in all the studies we've looked at. What's more controversial are some of the means for agency staff to reduce the herds through targeted removal program. Support for targeted removal is linked to trust. If they trust the agency, they have a medium perceived risk of chronic wasting disease, trust the agency to do the right thing, to use the proper science, they will support the agency in targeted removal. They want CWD eliminated. They do not want it to spread. A lot of these are common sense, but most hunters would like to see increased tags and longer seasons to combat the spread of CWD. Monetary incentives, like we have the money for that, are not preferable. Sometimes some of these studies use hypotheticals that you kind of have to scratch your head. Hunter trust in wildlife agencies. This is the bottom line. Across the states, moderate trust in agencies to address CWD. More than 65% of the people in all these states studied feel that the agency is doing the proper job to combat CWD. Between 50 and 67% believe agency information about CWD is believable and credible. What we've looked at in Illinois is we've examined hunters, 3,000 hunters in the CWD counties, 3,000 hunters in 1 to 2 counties adjacent, and 5,000 hunters, downstate, and then another 3,000 homeowners in the CWD area. And we find that across the board, they believe the information and that the agency is performing, using the proper science to combat chronic wasting disease. They're satisfied with how officials inform the public of CWD. And yet, they're not scoring very high on knowledge of CWD. They do have high trust in the agency. They feel that their agencies, respectively, are doing the right thing. Even in the areas where there's highly contested about the actual management options, they still feel they have a high degree of trust to the agency's efforts. Non-hunting landowners and citizens are less aware of chronic wasting disease and management. They really don't quite know what it is and what's going on. The information is coming from some of the same sources as hunters, less so from the outdoor press, but from some of the newspapers in the areas where CWD is found. And we're basing this on Illinois, Wisconsin, and some of the key states out west. Similar trust and concerns, except that they don't understand the impact on hunting. Guides and outfitters, they're worried about their bottom line. If there are stringent controls placed on caping out elk or deer, transporting them back to their home states, they're concerned that the permits are going to drop, sales of permits are going to drop in their locations. The agency attention is acceptable as far as they're concerned. They think that there's a little bit too much hype in some of the outdoor press. They're very knowledgeable about CWD, but again, not so much about the management options or the distribution of the diseases in their respective states. They're, of course, more concerned about the health of the deer, elk, cervid populations and their business, their bottom line. How is this going to affect their business? They have high agency trust, and again, looking at the economic impacts. Now, moving into accumulating kind of all of this background and where we are right now. We've had very few studies conducted over the past 4 years. There's a small one in Maryland looking at change in hunter permits and hunter behavior and their intention to hunt. In Illinois, we did this study in 2012 where we looked, as the one I just mentioned, where we broke down and we studied 16,000 people, surveyed 16,000 people across the state. And we're gearing up for another round, not quite as large, but we'll be looking at deer hunters and doing a survey of them next year. The focus now with chronic wasting disease studies is to evaluate the management options and the management practices put into place. So the comparisons of the CWD risk to other diseases across time and stakeholders. So what we have here is an example where in Illinois we conducted a survey in 2004 and followed up with it in our 2012 study where we've compared chronic wasting disease with both over time and with other diseases. And the perception of risk of CWD has dropped. The dashed line are hunters and the solid line is the general public. Now this also corresponds with fewer articles coming out. This is throughout Illinois, but the press attention to CWD has dropped considerably since the first outbreak in 2002. And looking at some of the numbers, we compared chronic wasting disease with BSE, use mad cow because it was easier for people to understand, Salmonella, E. coli, West Nile, and Lyme disease. So we had 2 TSEs, 2 foodborne diseases, and 2 insect-borne diseases. The perception of risk has dropped over that time across all of these, with the exception of E. coli and Salmonella. But E. coli and Salmonella are still current in the news. You have outbreaks, you have issues with restaurants and so forth. So that media attention has kept it in the forefront of people's minds. Not so much with what we're seeing with some of the others. We have outbreaks, it gets attention, but after a while, it kind of gets to be in the background. We looked at this gradient from hunters in the CWD counties, 1 to 2 counties adjacent and downstate. And what we see here, I don't know if the point is working. No. Yeah, what we see here, this is on a scale of -3 to +3. It's a 7-point scale, strongly disagree to strongly agree, with 0 being the neutral point. So the lower the number is more they disagree with the risk to humans. So in CWD counties, they have the lowest score for risk of CWD to humans, but it's a little bit higher in the downstate counties. The risk to deer herd, you can see it's a little bit lower, but still into the agreement phase for risk to deer herd in the CWD counties, and it increases the further you get away from there. The same with trust and DNR. It increases the further you get away from the CWD counties, and trust in DNR information, trust in DNR management. So, just did it again. Okay. So what we're seeing here is that the trust and the perceived risks are lowest in the CWD counties. These people have been hearing the messaging for almost 15 years now. It's fitting in with some social theories that we're seeing, relatively new social theories that we're seeing with bioterrorism and some other high-risk areas. AIDS research as well. The more messaging people, it's called information overload theory. The more messaging people get, the more likely they are to turn off to the message. They get inundated, they're overwhelmed by it. And they revert back to their previous behavior, which may be risky. Now, we can't say for certain that that's what we're seeing with CWD, but it fits the pattern that we're seeing with other areas of known risk. So bioterrorism is one example where this is pretty prevalent. So this may be what we're seeing. But what we also may be seeing is because of the targeted removal program in Illinois, hunters are less likely to come across a CWD positive deer. The hunters are coming up with about 0.6% of the total harvest being positive deer, whereas from the sharpshooting program is about 2.5%. So much of our deer that we test, the large proportion of them are coming out of the targeted removal program, and hunters aren't seeing as much. So maybe as hunters are not knowing of anyone who shot a CWD positive deer, they themselves aren't shooting a CWD positive deer, they start to discount the messaging and they don't see the threat as real. This is what we're going to be following up with in our study next year. The stakeholder support for management. In our study in Illinois, hunters are evenly split on support for targeted removal when given likely outcomes. 52% favored ending the sharpshooting with higher likelihood of the disease spreading. 48% favor the continued sharpshooting with a higher likelihood of reduced spread. These are hunters in the CWD county. So pretty much it's about a 50-50 split. Now, why are they opposed to sharpshooting? They trust the agency. They think they're doing a good job, and they feel that they're using proper science. They want to shoot the deer themselves. That's the reason. Now, these deer are not accessible to hunters. They're being removed with a bait pile under a swing set while the shooters sit on the deck behind the family's home at night. These are not areas that are open to hunting, and the hunters really still kind of aren't believing us in that. So it isn't that these deer would be available for hunting anyway, but they just feel that they should be the ones shooting the deer, not Illinois DNR. Chronic wasting disease management, we've also been looking at the potential for conflict. And what I'm going to show here is something called potential of conflict index. The smaller the circle, the more consensus there is on the issue. The larger the circle, the more disagreement there is. And you'll notice there's a midline here horizontally. That's 0. Above that line, they agree. Below that line, they disagree. So to continue to test deer and elk for CWD, small circle, a lot of consensus, very positive, keep it up. No action, allow CWD to take its course, small circle, very negative, don't. Using trained agency staff to dramatically reduce herds in affected zones. It's right on the neutral line. They're right above, some are above or in agreement, some are in disagreement. It's a large circle. There's a real lack of consensus on this. There's a lot of disagreement. Use hunters to dramatically reduce herds in affected areas. It's a lot of agreement on this. It's relatively a small circle, but not as we would see to continue to test deer and elk. So there's still a little bit of wiggle room on that, but overall it's very positive. Trust in CWD management. Working on a paper right now looking at this across different hunting types. And archery hunters are exhibiting the rather lowest trust of archery, firearm in Illinois, that would be shotgun, and muzzleloader hunters. Now, there's some noise in here that I'm trying to really get to, because archery hunters tend to have kind of a love-hate relationship with the agency anyway. It's whether it's over the season length, which in our case is 5.5 months, use of compound or use of crossbows, number of permits. There's a lot of other factors that can be contributing to this. But the bottom line is the archery hunters are expressing the least amount of trust in the agency's CWD management, whereas firearm and muzzleloader hunters are showing greater trust. So where are we going to go from here? Well, what would be ideal would be some of the longitudinal panels, look at some of the actual behavioral changes in response to actual CWD conditions. Follow the same hunters over time. Who changes behavior and why? What's driving them? And what kind of behavioral changes do we see? What is the effect of the information that they're receiving and the source of this information? We need to have a better understanding of how this information is being utilized. Maybe a pre and post test would be useful. If an agency is going to put out a campaign on chronic wasting disease, go in at time 0 and survey then and do a follow-up after, say, 2 years and note the effectiveness of that campaign. Site-specific economic analyses over time. In these rural communities that are dependent upon deer hunting for the lifeblood of those communities, we need to be able to go in and look at the conditions before and after. So what we're talking about here in these examples is being able to have a ground base for understanding before CWD hits. Now, that's a lot to ask for, perhaps. What we've been doing is being reactive. But if we can get a baseline of data beforehand, we can have a better understanding of some of the social impacts of chronic wasting disease. What are the economic impacts beyond hunting? Rocky Mountain National Park and elk viewing. Some of the other areas, the National Elk Range. Some other areas where tourism and wildlife viewing plays a large role in the local economy. Looking at the human dimensions is involving the captive industry, public understanding of it, just perceptions overall. And additional regional and multi-state studies. We have several states now that have been dealing with CWD for many years. And looking at these studies across the breadth so we can ask the same questions in each of these states at the same time. Now, what Jerry Vasky and I have been working on is we're asking the same questions in multiple states, so we're now developing some of what we see here as a concrete data set that we can compare. Well, how do Colorado hunters feel versus Wisconsin hunters versus Illinois hunters? And then we have the different management scenarios to kind of use as our experimental base. We need more of that. And then we have to look at involving greater stakeholders, some of the NGOs, just many of the stakeholders that are out there, and understanding, the perceptions that various stakeholders and constituent groups have regarding chronic wasting disease, and also have regarding the management of CWD. And then finally looking at the other countries, Canada, South Korea, Norway, not just Norway, looking at some of the other Nordic countries, Sweden and Finland, looking at maybe perhaps some of the safeguards that they're putting into place, their perceptions of chronic wasting disease, and again, being proactive, getting out there and trying to see, map the landscape before chronic wasting disease hits. Potential economic impacts, hunting decline, licensed tourism as mentioned, reducing reducing wildlife viewing, meat safety. This is going to be a big issue going forward as we are comparing, starting to also bring in the lead shot fragmentation and meat safety. Adding chronic wasting disease to this is also going to start to really cause some confusion or some reticence on some people's part as far as consuming venison. Funding for research and testing. There's never enough money out there, but not taking into account the human dimensions of chronic wasting disease, it needs to be part of the equation. In Wisconsin, again, we found subsequent declines, economic loss as an example, and these losses, even if it's only for a few years, can have irreparable damage to rural communities. So with that, I would like to stop and acknowledge my sponsors, which the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, Federal Aid and Wildlife Restoration. We'd like to thank the Western Association of Fish and Wildlife Agencies and all of the individual state agencies who helped us with all of this work. Thank you.